Hello and welcome to another edition of Diplomatic Channel. I'm Amarachi Ubani. It's been 6 months since the attack by Hamas militants on Israel. 1,200 people were killed on the day and more than 200 people taken hostage into Gaza, triggering an Israeli offensive dead set on killing every Hamas militant in the Strip. Israel's response to the Hamas attack and its offensive in the region has killed over 33,000 people since it started in October 2023. Israelis on Sunday marked the 6-month anniversary and hostages taken with pictures of victims held up by sticks in an open field. But Israel has a lot of explaining to do to its Western allies, especially those affected by the attack on humanitarian aid workers employed by World Central Kitchen, an internationally recognized humanitarian organization. On April 1st, 2024, 7 aid workers were hit by Israeli airstrike while delivering aid in Gaza. The aid workers were nationals of Australia, Canada, US, Gaza, Poland, and the United Kingdom. The Israel Defense Forces admitted culpability and fired 2 senior officers following an investigation into the airstrikes. An internal probe revealed by the IDF showed significant error and protocol violations that led to multiple strikes on the aid convoy. The IDF says those who approved the strike were convinced that they were targeting armed Hamas operatives and not WCK employees. They said the attack on the aid vehicles is a serious mistake which stemmed from a serious failure as a result of wrong identification, a mistake in decision-making, and an attack contrary to the orders and open fire regulations. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu himself described the airstrike as unintended and tragic, and that these things happen in wartime, also promising that Israel would do everything for this not to happen again. The attacks have drawn reactions from the US, the UK, and even Australia. US President Joe Biden said he's outraged and heartbroken by the deaths of the 7 humanitarian workers from World Central Kitchen, including 1 American in Gaza. UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said he was shocked and saddened by the deaths, while Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese slammed Israel's explanation. Meanwhile, in Rwanda this weekend, the country marked 30 years since the genocide, and President Paul Kagame slammed the international community for failing Rwanda during the genocide. As with all of the ceremonies preceding this one, the 30th anniversary of the genocide in Rwanda was solemn yet profound, as President Paul Kagame reflected on the event that changed the country's political and cultural course from 1994. Commemorated at the Kigali Genocide Memorial, the event was witnessed by other African leaders such as President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa and President of the African Development Bank, Akiwumi Adesina, and a host of others. More than 250,000 victims of the genocide have been buried at the Kigali Memorial, even though more than 800,000 people, largely Tutsis, but also a moderate number of Hutus, were slaughtered in the 100 days that the genocide lasted.
This flame symbolizes not only our past, but the hope for tomorrow. It will keep burning for the next 100 days.
His Excellency President Paul Kagame.
In his address to the world, President Paul Kagame said Africa needed to learn lessons from the genocide, just like Rwanda has. But he blamed the international community for failing Rwanda in its time of need.
The remnants of those forces are still in eastern Congo today, where they enjoy state support in full view of the United Nations peacekeepers, their objectives have not changed. And the only reason this group today, known as FDLR, has not been disbanded is because their continued existence serves some unspoken interest.
He also said Rwanda was completely humbled by the magnitude of its loss and that lessons learned are engraved in blood.
The more Rwanda takes full responsibility for its own safety and dignity, the more intensely the established truth about the genocide is questioned and revised.
French President Emmanuel Macron had sent a recorded video message earlier on Sunday, acknowledging that his country and its allies could have stopped the genocide, but lacked the will to do so. Joining me now is foreign affairs commentator and legal expert, Mr. Femi Ojumo, who is also founder and principal partner at Balliol Myers LP, a commercial law practice and multidisciplinary strategy consultancy based in Lagos. Mr. Ojumo wears many hats, among which is an acclaimed author. He's written a book, which we'll discuss at another time, of course. He's also a columnist with one of the newspapers here in Nigeria and a global speaker. Thank you for making time to be on Diplomatic Channel.
Oh, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, and you know, the first issue that we're discussing is this war in Gaza. It's been going on for, well, it's almost 7 months now, about
That's
7
right.
months since October 2023. The most remarkable, not remarkable, but the most landmark event that has happened in this war is the attack on the food aid workers, the foreign food aid workers.
Yes.
7 of them dead, 6 of them belonging to different nationalities, have different nationalities, one of them being Palestinian. The Israeli government has been trying to repair its image, it seems, you know, before the international community. Prime Minister Netanyahu apologized, you know, to these countries, also apologized to the rest of the world, saying this was not deliberate. He apologized not to the Palestinian who was amongst them, which was quite interesting. This apology, do you think it carries any weight?
To be honest, it is most disconcerting because over 33,000 Palestinians have been killed since the commencement of this war on the 7th of October 2023. Over 1,200 Israelis have been killed, and that has been rightly and roundly condemned globally. Now, the issue here, which concerns me and certainly lots of people, objective people around the world, is what appears to be the indiscriminate attacks on Palestinian civilians. And that must be condemnable because, of course, Israel, under Article 51 of the UN Charter, has the inherent right to self-defense. That's not in dispute. The issue, the fundamental issue here, is the disproportionality of those attacks. I mean, it's been going on. I mean, about 90 Palestinian journalists have been killed. An American journalist was killed some time ago. So when we hear this statement from Netanyahu, from Bibi Netanyahu, saying, well, it was a mistake. Well, mistakes do happen, but Israel has sophisticated weaponry, intelligence, which should guide their decision-making and precision attacks. So it does concern me.
Yeah, and you know, that's the part I find really concerning because the IDF is very precise with its targets. But then, you know, these workers were clearly identified.
Yes.
The founder, Jose Andres, says, you know, the itinerary was given to the IDF, was well known to them.
Well,
and then the vehicles, the 3 vehicles, were clearly identified. So they could not have made a mistake with the targets. Let's assume that it was even deliberate. What do you think that, you know, the IDF would have wanted to achieve with this attack?
Well, assuming without conceding that it was deliberate, there's a pattern here where the IDF deliberately, from what we're reading in authoritative papers and organizations, they want to exclude the media, you know, and they've said it very publicly that they want to exterminate Hamas. The IDF have said that. So it would be difficult for them to do that if there's the presence of media on ground. So it is an issue which Israel, with Bibi Netanyahu, would have to address because they are the occupying power. And with the occupying power, under humanitarian law, they must act responsibly. They must act proportionately. And what we are seeing is the converse of that. They're not acting with reasonableness, with proportionality, because so many innocent civilians have been targeted and killed, you know. So that's a huge concern.
Speaking of the media on the ground, no foreign journalist is in Gaza. You only have local journalists, and just a few of them, I think, with Al Jazeera also, that just has journalists on the ground.
Yes.
They have also lost a few,
Absolutely.
unfortunately. Yes. Our hearts go out, to my colleagues on the field who are there covering the story, but it is because of their efforts that we're able to know some of the, the issues that have come out of this war. Do you think that Netanyahu has lost focus with the war? The death toll is rising, as you rightly pointed out. There's a humanitarian crisis on the ground. Earlier in the week, the UN warned about, sewage tanks overflowing. So there's a possibility of an outbreak of a disease. And then there's, of course, a lack of food. There are these, airdrops that come every once in a while.
Yes.
People have lost their lives trying to catch some of that food aid, in Gaza, and it's been quite dangerous. And then there's also been innocent civilians who have been killed. The calls for a ceasefire is growing. Even at home, it seems he's lost the support of Israelis in this war.
Yeah.
Do you think he's lost focus?
I really think he's got a massive challenge on his hands on two grounds. Number one, he wants to act with the strong man image. He's going to wipe out Hamas. But the reality on the ground is, and this is the second issue, the reality on the ground is you have over 100 Israeli hostages still in captivity. And the mediation efforts by Qatar and other countries have suggested a negotiation whereby there's a prisoner exchange, the hostages are exchanged for Palestinians. Bibi Netanyahu and the right-wing elements in his cabinet are opposed to that. But for every day that intransigence remains, people are dying, there's more starvation, there's more hunger, and there's more death and crisis in that region. So it speaks to the issue of mission creep, because if the central strategic focus was to wipe out Hamas, well, what is the proportion of Hamas fighters relative to the thousands of Palestinian children, women who are being killed on a daily basis? And the world just seems to have lost track. So it's a huge concern. So yes, I think he has lost focus.
The world seems to have lost track. Only UN resolutions seem to have been the only moves being made.
Yes.
I know we've seen the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken in the Middle East about 3-4 times.
Yes.
Well, about 3 times, I think. He's made several visits. He's met with Netanyahu. He's also been on the Palestinian side. He's also met with Saudi Arabia. He's met with Egyptian leaders. And it just seems like a lot of talk is going on, but very, very little is really being done to stop this war. What can they do to implore on Netanyahu?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. The United States, as I said, is in a massive quandary here. On the one hand, they are, if you like, the international policemen of the world, and with that comes huge responsibilities, i.e. they need to be seen to act fairly and responsibly by the whole world. Now, Israel is a major strategic ally of the United States, okay? Israel is one of the largest export destinations for American weaponry, okay? And America is, if you like, fighting a proxy war with Iran. So the United States needs a very powerful Israel, strategically positioned in that region to be able to contain the excesses real or imagined, of Iran and other outlaws, according to the US. So Joe Biden is in a real tough situation here, but we're seeing, as you say, very little results for all the shuttle diplomacy which Antony Blinken has been making to Israel and the wider Middle East. So the question now is, well, results need to be had. We need to have results.
We're off on a short break now. Diplomatic Channel continues after. Stay with us. My conversation with Foreign Affairs commentator Femi Ojumu continues. Stay with us. Do you think this superpower is committing genocide in Gaza?
That is a very serious question. The United Nations Commissioner for Human Rights, Tok Volker, has made assertions in that direction, saying starvation is being used as a weapon of war. Effectively, it's a war crime. And, you know, when last time I checked the definition of genocide under the Genocide Convention, which was signed in 1948 and effective in 1951, it's very clear. Genocide, according to that convention, is the intention to kill, seriously harm a group of people, a nation, an ethnic group, a religious group, and to forcibly remove people, children from that area. So I think Israel is coming very close to that, if it is not already there. But informed international law experts have said, well, it's there. There was a commentary from Analyst, who used to be a former US State Department official, who said, well, Israel is effectively committing genocide, and her government, the US government, is not doing anything about it. And she resigned in protest to say, well, America needs to act and not just be spineless in this crisis, according to her, paraphrasing.
It kind of seems like, you know, America and all other Israeli allies are walking a fine line, doing this fine dance between trying to seem supportive to Israel, but also condemning Israel's actions, you know, because of the other side. They want to maintain relations with the other party as well. But speaking of genocide, incidentally, Sunday, April 7th, is the 30th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide. And we have to talk about that, don't we? Are there lessons to learn from what happened 30 years ago? And can those lessons be applied even to what's going on in Israel and perhaps what's going on in other parts of the world, maybe even here in Nigeria?
Yes. I think they're very serious and important lessons to be learned from the Rwanda genocide in 1994. We all recall how it started with the assassination of Juvenal Habyarimana, and the subsequent loss of over 750,000 people, and what went on in that country for so long. The key point for me is that there are no winners in genocidal wars, or in any wars for that matter. And the case for effective, proper diplomacy is more heightened and compelling than ever. That's the first point. The second point is, in relation to Rwanda, the international community woefully failed that country because they failed to stand up and support. I mean, what is the point of having the United Nations Security Council when people are being slaughtered and they don't act? And when I say they don't act, I'm not saying bringing F-16s, bringing Tomcats, putting boots to the ground. Why do we have United Nations peacekeeping forces? Why wasn't that sanctioned earlier? There is no defense whatsoever. And if care is not taken, the same mistakes, if it's predictable, then it's not a mistake. The same crisis is being repeated. And I wrote in some of my essays recently that, why can't we have peacekeeping forces in Palestine now? In the interest of objectivity, why will the UN Security Council not authorize that? I mean, we have a resolution on the table, which was agreed by 14 countries. The United States abstained. And I think that's a positive and pragmatic step, given the fact that in December and February, the US vetoed resolutions, UN Security Council resolutions, calling for a moratorium, for a ceasefire. But now they've abstained. So the question is, well, there must be political will, there must be momentum. It's no use passing these resolutions if it's not followed by action.
Right, right. And how does that apply to here in Nigeria?
Yes.
Unfortunately, up north, we seem to have gone past, terrorism, and we're now facing banditry and kidnappings. Then it's become rampant.
Yes.
It just seems to be coming all the way down. It's
That's
coming
right.
down to the south now.
It's certainly heralds important lessons for Nigeria. The case for effective leadership, effective action to contain this, and the case for international cooperation and collaboration, I think, is stronger than ever, because Nigeria has tried to contain the terrorism, the banditry for over a decade, with varying degrees of success. With varying degrees. But I think there's much more that can be done, should be done, and must be done straight away in that regard, both in kinetic terms, in non-kinetic terms. And of course, there's a case for tackling the needs. By needs, I mean those not in education, employment, or training. There must be an education and socioeconomic strategy to deal with those who have been cut off society, as it were. Because if they're not in employment, education, they're not working, what are they going to do? So they must be engaged somehow. And the strategy, the containment strategy, needs to address that. So that's a non-kinetic option, if you like. Whereas the kinetic options, the military options, that must go hand in hand on a day-to-day basis as well.
Or in simpler terms, the political will.
Yes.
Which is what you mentioned earlier. Yes. Speaking of which, you were right. Paul Kagame that's the president of Rwanda, did mention on Sunday morning that the international community did fail Rwanda, and whether out of contempt or cowardice was what he said.
Yeah.
You already mentioned, the role that the international community did not play in Rwanda. 30 years on, do you think the country has healed?
I think they've made huge progress. It's certainly not perfect. Kagame is an iron-fisted leader. Some have called him a dictator. He's been in power for 24 years at least.
Since 2000.
Yeah, exactly. But the lesson we can take from that, or some lessons we can take from that, is African countries need strong leadership. Kagame is providing that. It is not perfect. There are questions as to whether he's a democrat. Some would argue that he's a pernicious dictator. So opinion is mixed on that. Is the country moving forward? They're making advances towards socioeconomic progress, yes. Internationally, they're having pacts with the likes of the United Kingdom in the very controversial asylum program, which I think raises very interesting questions from an African perspective, from a legal perspective, because if people are fleeing asylum, and they go to the likes of the United Kingdom, the UK sends them away sends failed asylum seekers to Rwanda. The question is, what is Rwanda's commitment to the asylum process, to the Convention on Human Rights, and what are the rights of those people in Rwanda when there are questions, serious questions, about Rwanda's own commitment to human rights and the rule of law. So I think that demands further cross-examination.
President Paul Kagame is a really interesting president of Rwanda. I just mentioned he's been in power since 2000. He's going to run again.
Yes.
A few of the political parties in the country endorsed him as the next president. And it seems like, for every election since he's come into power in Rwanda, there's been no viable opposition. And I think that is a problem for many African countries, the presence of viable opposition. Is Paul Kagame a democratic leader? Is he the leader that should continue leading Rwanda even at this time? I know he's been one of the toughest leaders we've had in Africa.
Yes.
He's spoken truth to power to the UK. He's spoken to these other countries. When the journalists ask questions, he criticizes them and throws back the questions back at them. But if you're really looking at a real exemplary leadership for Africa, does he really fit the bill?
Well, again, the answer to that question would depend on one's philosophical outlook. Some would say Kagame is a dictator because he runs a one-party state, an authoritarian regime, and he's done that for a quarter of a century. So we don't need to lose too much time over that. Others would say, well, he might not be your perfect example of a democrat, but he's a pragmatic leader, and his leadership style works for his country. He's been able to ensure there's a reasonable modicum of stability in that country. There's relative peace, not perfect peace by any means. There's relative peace and progress in that country. Rwanda is now a nation to be reckoned with internationally. It's an agrarian economy, if you like, but it's a major tourist destination from across Africa, from around the world, and the economy is opening up. Plus, they have a visa-free policy for
visa on
Africans.
arrival.
Yes, visa on arrival. In other words, they are open to relationships, open to trade, open to cooperation and friendliness amongst nations. So that is a plus. So I would say it would depend on one's ideological view as to whether he's a dictator or a pragmatic leader.
Well, thank you so much, Femi Ojomo. It's been a real pleasure having you here on Diplomatic Channel. We should have this conversation again sometime.
I look forward to that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is where we end the program this week. You can always watch this again. Just log on to youtube.com/channelsweb, search on the playlist for Diplomatic Channel, and you're ready. I'm Amarachi Ubani. I'll see you next time.